Can I welcome you all to this EMCC Global GPS Dialogue? Really excited to have Karen and Lawrence here from Grant Thornton today, exploring the subject of governance in coaching. And I know this is a topic which Karen opened at the Global Provider Summit itself in November 2022. So I'm really excited to see developments since then as well. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand you straight over to Karen and Lawrence.
Nicola, thanks very much indeed. It's always really great to connect with you, and it's lovely to see everybody, both colleagues that we work with, Lawrence and I, fellow coaches, and people I recognise from other webinars that we've all been on. So welcome to this session, as I named it, the 10 myths of internal versus external coaching governance. And my partner said to me this morning, he said, whatever that means. There may be several of you in the audience today who are thinking to yourselves, actually, what does it mean? Is it a term that is applicable for us as coaches, procurement, procurers of coaching, providers of coaching, and indeed internal or external coaching groups? And the purpose of today really is to explore that whole subject, to start a dialogue around, or continue a dialogue, I guess, around this subject of what governance means in coaching, and can it actually help us to take the phrase professionalising our industry to another level, or alongside that same professionalisation, what else perhaps do we want to think about that will move us on to a different dialogue? As Nicola said, I started this conversation late last year with Sam Isaacson, who very kindly came on and introduced me. And my thinking was very much around how can you connect the subject of governance, which I do a lot of work around in terms of being a board evaluator at Grant Thornton. How can you connect the subject of corporate governance with coaching? And therefore, as coaches, do we have a responsibility to not just perhaps be working on the behavioural, the interpersonal, the technical areas of our practice, but actually thinking about the governance aspects of our practice as well? And how can we as coaches help board directors and executive directors think in different ways about what governance means to them? It's more than a framework, and what that means and how they can actually work within that system of governance to actually make more in terms of performance and growth. And as a result of that and the feedback we got from the session, it just got me thinking, actually, let's move this on to the whole subject of the industry. And let's have an opportunity to get your thoughts from wherever you come in the industry around what this could mean and whether it is an interesting and important dialogue to have. So I mentioned I've been coaching actually for about 30 years now, and had the delightful opportunity of doing my master's at Henley 10 years ago. So for any shout out for any colleagues, any fellow coaches who were on that cohort, we had a wonderful time. But I also have been coaching for many years of that 30 years of coaching at an executive level. And I think the whole subject of trying to professionalise further our practice by actually being able to incorporate the language of business into our practice helps make those connections and rapport between ourselves as coaches, coaching providers, and the organisation. So that's the work and the purpose of today. But before any further ado, I'd just like to introduce Lawrence, my colleague, who I hugely admire and love working with. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Karen. So just by way of introduction, Karen talks about whatever governance means. And Karen and I had a conversation last week which kind of brought up some of those issues in a very real life kind of way, which is why Karen asked me to join this morning. So to introduce myself, I'm Lawrence Parsons, and I'm responsible for leadership development here in Grant Thornton, which includes coaching. And that means I wear a variety of different hats. Sometimes I can be a coach, sometimes I can be a coach supervisor, but also I think this is probably my main role is to manage the system as a whole and to be responsible for that system as a whole. At the moment, the reason I'm here is because a few things have come together that kind of encapsulate and explain for me and bring to life some of the things that Karen has just spoken about. So Grant Thornton, we have, actually coaching could probably mean three different things to an organisation. It's an everyday skill that it might want a whole variety of people to use. Managers, leaders, we expect people to use this skill every day. It might mean external coaches. And I'm aware that we've got many people on the call who will badge themselves as coaches, professional coaches, or work for coaching organisations. It's also for some organisations, and Grant Thornton does this too, we will train up and accredit internal coaches, job plus coaches. And an organisation could have a mixture of all these three parts to its ecosystem of coaching. Well, in Grant Thornton at the moment, we are just going through EMCC accreditation, which happens every 5 years. So I've had my head in various paperwork and stats to get that done. It has been a real reminder, though, about the standards and governance attached to that word coach. The minute we say to someone, you will receive a coach or you will be coached, what is the weight of meaning attached to that word? What quality can they expect and who defines the quality of that experience? So our EMCC accreditation has been a huge reminder of what this word means. At the same time, and I'm going to hold confidentiality here, there is an employee in the firm, in Grant Thornton, who is being coached by an external professional coach at the moment, and they're a very good external professional coach. And their people manager, this individual's people manager, their leader, wants to be involved in some way, which actually, with all the issues around confidentiality in mind, that's a perfectly permissible thing in my books for someone to do. This individual, as well as having a coach to develop them, their leader, their people manager, also has a responsibility to be involved in setting goals, in contracting, in kind of continuing to keep touch with that relationship. Now, I thought at the time, because something cropped up in coaching, which we had to raise with the people manager, and it got a dialogue going on with the coach. And we just thought, goodness me, there's about at least 6 different ethical issues have just occurred in this. Things around confidentiality, things around skill, things around contracting, all of these things have just happened. But they haven't happened because anything has gone wrong. They've happened because things have gone right. Coaching is addressing a real need. We have a highly skilled coach working with the individual, and their leader is actively involved. And again, that made me think, as a buyer of coaching, I might be able to outsource things. I could go to a business and say, please, do our coaching for us. But I cannot outsource the governance. I cannot outsource the ethical issues. I cannot outsource quality control. And it was a huge reminder to me that whatever attitude an organization takes to coaching, everything we do around governance and quality is still a really live issue. So I hope that brings the topic a little bit to life for you with a few examples. Karen, I'll hand back to you now.
Lawrence, thank you so much. Isn't it wonderful, everyone, when you get onto a subject, you put it out there and the universe brings it all back. I'll share an example that happened at 3 o'clock this morning for me, but just talking this through with Lawrence recently just brought a whole new set of contexts and perspectives to the conversation, which we're going to share. Thanks already for the comments in the chat. And we'll pick up on those as we go. If it's okay with everyone, we will get started, but very mindful that I want to pick up on the points that have come through from Mikhail, from Esther and others. And Lawrence will be picking those up as we move along.
I just wanted clarification on what Lawrence said was when that happened in the example, were they all together, the leader, the coach and the coachee, or did it happen with the coachee missing? Sorry, I just wanted that clarification.
So as with anything in coaching, there is no mechanical answer to this. We have principles that we bear in mind. And the principles I had to bear in mind was, first and foremost, the welfare of the individual and their coaching experience. Also confidentiality, of course, but also as an employer, the responsibility that a leader has for their own people. And I couldn't take that away from them as a leader. I couldn't kind of say, hands off, back off, you have nothing to do with this, with your person, because actually it was their responsibility. Let's just say there was a few phone calls before a number of us got on a call together to make sure that everything was done in an open, honest, contracted way.
That's a wonderful link, actually, as well, Lawrence. Thank you. Thanks, Tineke, for that clarity. It's a wonderful example of when predefined governance creates a framework in which these sort of ambiguities can be discussed. And I think actually setting those in place and knowing that we have those tools, whichever part of the coaching ecosystem we work in, is really helpful. It'd be really great to actually know who we've got on this webinar today. So we're going to do a quick poll just to ask you what your role is. And Nicola's just launched that. And we'd just like you to think about, first of all, where you are in terms of the coaching ecosystem. If you could just click on one or maybe more than one choices around that. And then you'll see further down on question 2 a question. So great. Thank you so much for giving us a clear indication of the mix that we have in the room, which I think is really helpful to get a view from as many sides as possible. So that's been really helpful. And then the second question is, how well do you understand what is meant by the term coaching governance? And immediately we've got Cheryl coming back. Thanks, Cheryl. That's really helpful.
My question is the understanding, the coach's understanding of governance and what it means and how it's defined. I'm not sure I understand that well in terms of accountability and everything else that goes with governance.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Cheryl. And I think, that just sums up where we're at in this conversation, doesn't it? Anything else coming through, Nicola, in terms of people's degree of understanding in terms of the second poll?
Most people, 41%, so they understand it fairly well. And then it's like a classic bell curve. So with 25% and 18% respectively going either not well or well. And then if I were to plot this, it'd be a classic bell curve here. Most people here, 41%, so they understand it fairly well. But there's people, 5% not at all, and 11% very well. So it's a classic bell.
Wonderful. Okay, so let's get started. And let me just start by setting the context for us all as we put the slides up to spend some time working through the context. I just wanted to pose these thoughts for all of us. Whether we're a coach working within an organisation or an external coach working into an organisation, how often do we feel alone? And how often do we actually work alone as a coach? Because there is this whole subject that Lawrence alluded to around confidentiality, that working confidentially and working alone are two different things. And I think that's something that's really important that we explore. And I wonder how we as coaches, we connect with the wider ecosystem of coaching when we're connecting. And Lawrence gave a very good example of how we get those contradictions as coaches and coaching providers. So although we work alone in terms of that one-to-one communication and that work, we are part of a wider system and accountable to that wider system. And conversely, thinking about organizations in terms of where we sit as organizations in terms of coaching procurers as well as coaching providers. What is our responsibility to the ecosystem and the framework of making sure that we're getting the most from coaching? What are your thoughts as coaching providers about what coaching means in your organization? And is there some form of business case, some form of articulation around what coaching should be delivering for the organisation? Or is it just a soft acceptance that coaching is there as part of a wider provision for people development? Something for us to pose and think about. I'd just like to say again, welcome if you're on live and demand. We're going to go into the main session now. And I'd like to just set some context for you around that. I feel Lawrence's case study is a really important one because it brings together so many different subject areas around governance in coaching, both from the coach perspective, whether that coach be internal, external, whether it be from the organisation, the procurement part of provision of coaching, and indeed the wider group of stakeholders such as the people manager and others. So here we go. 10 myths of internal versus external coaching governance. What in heck's name do I mean about that? Well, these are the things we're going to be looking at over the next hour or so. First of all, what do we mean? The second part we're going to look at is 10 myths that I have to say I've come up with after my many years of coaching experience and speaking with other coaches to get their views and to identify whether there is a difference between internal coaching governance and the provision of governance that any external provider that you're procuring with brings to the table. And in fact, as individual coaches, have we really ever thought about what surrounds us in terms of our provision? It's not just the coaching, it's more than that if we want to professionalize what we do. Finally, we're going to look at the links between good governance and in your coaching practices and the potential outputs of that. Does it actually help our coaching to have better rigor? Okay, let's just start by thinking about what we've got already, because the interesting thing is we do have codes of conduct and competencies to work with. And does that really represent governance? I'm just trying to move down, page down. There we go. Let's start by looking at the definition of governance. What actually does governance mean? Well, in its raw sense, where we're using the word governance, we are talking about the means of governing an organisation. And I love this United Nations definition of what good governance is. And if you go into the UN good governance definition, what I love about it is that it's a principles-based definition. In other words, it's just not only about a framework and a series of systems and processes, which it obviously in certain situations can be devolved to. It is more than systems, it's more than processes. It's very much about mindset, it's about conduct, it's about what we as coaches, what we as coaching providers bring to this ecosystem. And it's really worth having a look at what the UN say around that, which I found fascinating. And I also found this great quote from Mark Carney. And I tried to apply it to coaching. Good governance does not guarantee long-term success. Good coaching governance does not guarantee long-term success. However, the highway of coaching failures, maybe the lack of ability to be successful, perhaps, is littered with the carnage caused by poor performance. Well, does it work? Probably not. We know ourselves as coaches and coach providers that coaching fundamentally works and it delivers great value for the individual. I think where the exploration for us today is how much value is it delivering the organisation and the wider system, and how accountable are we all to actually making sure that those stories, that representation, even that, I guess that the publicity around success, how can we go about doing that appropriately to ensure that all the stakeholders in the states in the system of coaching recognise that coaching drives performance and growth, because that's the key message. So I came up with what type of organisations? We'll come back in a minute. You're talking about Esther asking a question. I'll come back to that in a moment, Esther. The framework and manner of governing an organisation or a system. I think this sort of probably starts to set some context for us. And we can start to think about what we mean by governing coaching practice, whether we be individual coaches, whether it be a group of coaching providers, or whether we be an internal coach provision. What do we actually mean by the framework and manner of governing the system? Well, let's have a look at what we've already got at the moment. First of all, we've got a wonderful set of ethics that are produced back in, I think, is it 2015? Yes, which talk about what the conduct is that we as coaches should consider as part of our practice. And my view on them is that they're very helpful. My other view on them is, when did I last visit them? And yet one of the things the Code of Ethics says on its website is very much around the Global Code of Ethics talk about each time we engage in a new coaching intervention, we should be sharing this code of ethics with our coachee and indeed the people manager or whoever else is in the stakeholders system. But there are wonderful means of starting to frame out our thinking about what we are responsible and accountable for. And there's lots on there to actually revisit. We've also got the EMCC competency framework. As assessors of our programme internally at Grant Thornton, our EQA accredited EMCC coaching programme, we use the competency framework as a final sign-off when we're actually meeting with coaches who've been through the programme and are looking to get accreditation. And these 8 areas of our practice create rich conversations. But it struck me when I was looking at both the code of conduct and the competency framework that they are very much geared towards coaches and our own etiquette, our own professionalisation of the work we do. And I wondered where within that sits the responsibility for coaching providers, be they internal or external. And this started to populate the thinking for me around, is there something more we need to actually professionalise coaching in organisations? Thank you, Mick. Is it Mikkel? I hope it's Michael, EMCC competencies. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's start thinking, should we, before we go into the breakout room, the first breakout room, I wonder if there's any points, Lawrence, I know Esther's posted a couple that we ought to be picking up on.
I'm just reading those myself there, Karen. I'm intrigued by Esther's comment. I'm guessing we're both talking about the Frederick Laloux book on organisations. I would look at it slightly differently, from a slightly different lens here, and always think, if I'm going to say to someone, you're going to be coached, or if I'm going to say to someone, I'm going to introduce you to a coach, what is attached to that word? What can that unique human being expect to receive? And that, I think, is the practical application of governance, irrespective of whether a red, orange, green or teal organisation. What would that unique individual come to expect as the result of the governance that we put in place? And around that, I don't think it matters if we choose one form or a governance or another. It's not about policies, it's about the thought that goes into it, which is, I think, where the EMC competency framework comes in as an amazing resource.
Yeah. Anything else that you think is worth just bringing to the table?
Not, I may come back to them later. Okay,
lovely. So if it's okay with everybody, I'd like to take this one stage further, and if I can just get my slide to move. Nicola, can you? Thank you. And I make big apologies for this slide, but this is me brain dumping and doing a fair, lovely message there from someone. Doing some work, doing a bit of mini research, which I'd love you to look at, work getting some echo at the moment. Thank you. Thanks, Louisa. Yes, coming from conversations with coaches, coaching providers and whatever, these are my 10 myths. They may not be yours. You may want to challenge them. You may really recognize them as myths and not realities, or you may think to yourselves, do you know what, this is a reality. And I'm going to ask you to go into breakout rooms in a moment. And obviously, if you want to not go into a breakout room for discussion around this, make sure that you have on your name NBR. But if you do, and I'd really value your feedback, I'd love you to just work on these 10 myths. I got as far as 10 and more for internal provision. I only got as far as 7 with external provision. So if you've got any more, that would be great too. But I'm going to give you 15 minutes, just under 15 minutes, coming back at 10:45, if you would, to give some feedback to the group around these myths. Are they really myths? Are things changing? Is greater provision and clarity around how we manage the system in place in the organisations where you work or you coach into? Or indeed, do these things still exist? And they're not a myth at all, they're a reality. So let me just pose the question. And I would suggest, if it's okay with you, taking a photo of that rather busy slide, just so you've got that in your breakout room. Lovely. So as you can see, 10 myths. How many are actually myths in your opinion, and which particularly would you disagree or agree with, and why? And what are your thoughts around the quality of external provision versus internal provision in terms of coaching governance? And we're going to have sort of at least 3 or 4 different perspectives on that. So you need the time to talk. I think you're going to go into groups about 3 and 4. And we'll then take 5 minutes or so to get feedback at the end of your breakout session. But back in at 10:45, please. Everyone, welcome back. I hope you had a good conversation. And Michelle, before we go any further, I just wanted to acknowledge your message from the very beginning of the chat, where you were talking about supervision. What about supervision? And I hope that that came out as an area of discussion for you. But it'd be really great to just ask you just to take a moment to reflect, and anything for you that came out rather than within the group, but for you personally from this conversation. Perhaps you could just pop a few words into the chat and we can have a look at what your thoughts are in the moment.
What came out of the conversation is quite simple, is that there is a cultural difference between US and Europe. In Europe, supervision is something quite important, while in US, it's just an emerging process. And the second thing that emerged in the conversation is that, what about platforms? Also platforms that just pop up, and what kind of role do they have in all that? My experience of supervising coaches employed by platform, I think there is a potential big issues there. And I hope we will be able to discuss that during that webinar.
Michelle, merci beaucoup. Thank you very much indeed. And more widely, any immediate thoughts that you have that really struck you in the chat? It'd be great to see this complex and messy. Whoa, okay. Yes. So.
And by the way, I just published on supervision in big organizations. So because here in
thank you.
It's in French, so unfortunately, but I can send you.
As soon as it gets translated, Michelle, can we let us all know? It'd be wonderful. Thank you. Maybe if large organizations could.
Well, but I have done a study in 2016 on 22 big companies, looking at how we can organize coaching, internal, external, supervision, internal, external, and all that mess where how can we do?
How interesting. The word mess has come up 2 or 3 times now. I don't know if you've provoked that, Michelle. can people come off mute just for a few moments? It'd be lovely to get maybe next 5 minutes and get some feedback from you around your discussion groups and really what came through as real myths. Because I do appreciate this is a situational thing and we all have different experiences with different organisations. But what came out of that discussion for you? Lovely point. Who is responsible for governance?
Kathy, I think in our group, what came out, so I was the only internal coach in my group with 2 people who coach externally. And I think from sort of my perspective, the governance issue around coaching should be dealt with at the senior leadership strategic level. Because if it's not, it's left to people or in positions, you, Lawrence, or whoever, to sort of make things happen. Whereas if it's dealt at the senior level, said, this is our strategy, coaching is part of it. This is the governance around this, governance around that, because all organizations have governance. And it cuts for, and then it makes people who come to coaching sort of understand that this is for the framework, and it's not a negative thing, because all of us in the group feel that people are sent for coaching when they have an issue. And therefore, you almost start off on a coaching thing, thinking this person thinking, I've got a problem and I've come to you to fix it. And indeed, some of the problems that the coachees have are really organizational issues that they're coming to you to fix. So I think that in itself is an issue.
Lovely. Cheryl, thank you. That was really interesting insight, actually, from within the organisation about ownership. Who else?
We have other Cheryl Cooper with her hand up.
Just to make it clear that there are 2 of us, I thought I would better speak as well. So I'd be quite interested to hear actually from you, Lawrence, a bit more about that connection between external standards and accreditation and how that integrates with internal governance, because quite often, I mean, I'm like Michelle, I'm also a supervisor of internal coaches, and quite often I see that the internal coaching has evolved organically from a couple of enthusiasts. And so it's kind of a parallel process to what's going on in how things are structured and the strategies and development within the wider organisation. Not always, it's easy to generalise. So I'm interested in actually your experience of how you've integrated external accreditation standards, quality ethics with your existing governance in Grant Thornton.
So short answer, we're not perfect and it's a work in progress. But if I kind of talk around that, in Grant Thornton, all coaches have a trained supervisor who's also an employee. They have been trained to supervise by an external organisation. And there should be a number of meetings a year, depending on the amount of coaching that's taking place. And some of those should be one-to-one. So in theory, trained supervision happens, and also the supervisor is a supervisor. So as a system, that should kind of work. I'm going to come back to the title of the session, which Karen kind of gave out the myths. For me, a big myth, though, around coaching is that, if it's an internal model, it's soft and fluffy and informal. And actually, Karen is one of our internal coaches and coach supervisors, the people holding my feet to the fire, going, Lawrence, our standards are too low. The organisation needs to take this more seriously. Far from, which is actually right and true, and they should be doing that. So what I find is that internal coaches and internal supervisors, once they're trained, once they're qualified, they actually have hugely high standards. And if I contrast this with when external coaching businesses pitch to me, I'm sure that they have very high standards. I would just note that I can't remember the last time any of those businesses mentioned supervision when they were pitching to me. Does that kind of answer it for you, Cheryl?
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting, and it's great to hear about your experience with that, and what you're doing to actually raise standards too. Thank you.
And it's not just me. I'd actually add that it's not just like one human being in HR that does this.
Mm.
By having employees involved, by having trained supervisors within the firm, those people also champion this cause. It's not just kind of some guy in HR talking about it. It could be, one of our supervisors is a leading partner in the firm. They might also champion this.
And is that part of HR strategy or governance, all of this coaching process and standards internally?
I would simply say that there is a business decision around what coaching means to an organisation. Come back to, is this a lovely skill that we want all people to have? Is this something where we're going to pay someone to do this for us in a purposeful way? Or is this something we will champion in a purposeful way? And that each of those options is fine, and whatever mix of those options is fine. It's about a conscious choice by an organisation. Karen, do you want to add any?
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. I think that's really powerful. I think, and it's all those things, isn't it, as well, which makes it quite nebulous until you actually start to talk about it and think about actually what can we nail down. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes just to find out what came out. Anything further that you feel is really worth sharing with the group? I know there's been a lot of chat, which has been really helpful. Tinica, you've got your hand up. Thank you.
Yeah, I realized from listening to us today that when you talk about internal coaching makes that organization a coaching provider.
Yes, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is what I realized from listening to us today. External coaches, it's a little bit difficult because you either are individual coaches or you are part of an external coaching provider. And so the thing that we have to look at here is the organization that provides coaching, which in your case will be Grant Thornton. And how much the primary responsibility for governance needs to come from the client organization, which in your case is also a provider organization. You need to know what you want from the coaching. And so you need to manage the governance of the internal coaches, but also the governance of coaching providers, or I think the primary responsibility lies with you. Also, because when it goes wrong, it will affect your organization. Yeah. And you need to make sure that it's easier when you have an external provider, which happens to be a coaching provider with a panel of coaches. They can then make sure that their coaches actually adhere to what you require via them. And the same for your internal. So I think that you actually have such a good chance if, as a client organization, that's also internal coaching provider, you have such a good chance to oversee the overall. And also that also includes harvesting themes from your coaching, because I notice organizations don't do that. They don't harvest the value they can get anonymously back from the coaching. What are the themes underlying in your organization that normally doesn't surface? And also ROI. It's not so difficult to actually establish ROI of coaching. It's not difficult. There's financial ROI and there's behavioral ROI. So I'm going to leave it at that, but that's what I've realized from listening about what you've said.
So I'm going to take one more comment from you, Helen, but I think it's important to look at there's some wonderful comments coming through and some real, I guess, aha moments coming through around ownership, and whether there may be this space that we can get into together to really explore this in more depth. And I appreciate time is of the essence, but we'll move on to the final part of this session in a moment. But Helen, over to you.
Okay, just one point that picks up on both from our group and also Lawrence's point earlier, and just from my own experience, I've both sat both sides of the fence, both purchasing coaching and providing coaching. And I think a critical one for me that I'm a growing fan of is 3 ways that support the formal governance structure on paperwork and with supervision. And that is of the coach, manager and coachee having a 3-way, ideally at the beginning, at the end of the coaching. And I think that feeds into a good governance structure that I'm really quite a fan of now. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Helen, great. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Karen, is there time for me to comment on one of the comments?
Yes, of course, please. I'm just coming back over to you, because I know you've got a point to make as well.
Giovanna, I think, makes an excellent comment talking around kind of when organizations do what I described as the coaching for all model, where anyone in an organization could coach anyone else, and you have and I think that his point is that whenever an organization trains up people to coach other people in the organization, governance is an issue. And I just want to completely agree with Giovanna there. The minute we start training people to coach, what does that word mean? What standard are we training them to? How do we quality control that? I just want to completely agree with Giovanna there and say that really encourage that whenever an organization wants to do this, they need to put serious thought into that question.
Yeah. Wow, as Nicholas said, some absolutely wonderful, thought-provoking comments that are coming through, a real richness to this conversation. And I know, Lawrence, you mentioned to me when we were offline about the challenge of IT within this and coach provision through groups in that genre, and how you mentioned, I'll just quickly paraphrase what Lawrence said, which was that the conversation is usually technology driven, which is a useful part of the whole story. But actually, in terms of governance, the conversation is not about supervision. It's not about, what was the other point that you made, Lawrence? It doesn't talk about supervision. It doesn't
CPD.
CPD. Yeah, exactly. And it's all of these factors. So there's something here about actually, what do the external providers, what do we as external providers bring to the table? What is the responsibility of the organisation that should be predefined bring to the table? And therefore, what is the value that the individual coachee and organisation gain from that proper framework? So I'd like to just, we've got sort of about another 14 or so minutes left. So what I'd like to do, if I may, is take you back into the slide deck and set a context for a second discussion, which you can have just really for 10 minutes. This is something I put together. It's an adaptation of what I put together last time we were together talking about executive coaching in governance. And I wanted to try and create a sense of ownership around this whole subject that we've been discussing. So what I've actually done is looked at what are we as coaching providers, whether I'm an individual coach approaching an organisation, and alongside the code of conduct and the competencies, in terms of my governance, that what I bring to the organisation, that added value bit, what else should I be thinking about? And how else can I open that conversation up with the organisation I'm offering my services to? And there's a number of things here, like, as already been said, buy-in from the top. Lawrence does a fantastic job. We're a very flat organisation in terms of our culture. And at the same time, buying from the top from our partnership is key, because coaching is more than part of the HR function. It is a performance enabler and a growth enabler. A business case for coaching is so important to actually be able to articulate on a page what coaching is about, whether we're a coach or whether we're an organisation. What are our expectations? What are our standards that we actually live by and we will measure success by? Good governance, we've talked about repeatable processes and systems we know about, but it's more than that. Effective and efficient data survey platforms, we've talked about that, but it's not the be-all, end-all. Results measured and reported to the business in terms of the business language. So talking about performance, talking about results, talking about growth in teams, talking about better dynamics in the teams, better success in the teams, better well-being in the teams. And above all, telling those stories in ways that actually really gets the message out that coaching makes a difference. And on the other side, you'll see that I've actually identified the external forces that we're dealing with every day of our coaching careers in terms of what's coming at us and what defines the way we actually show up. How much do we need to be relevant to the wider system? And at the same time, not get hung up on the wider system, but to recognise that we need to hold it and be aware of it and relate to it all the time when we're coaching, when we're working with people managers, if they are part of that ecosystem. But what is the bigger picture? So, for instance, a question I might choose to ask an organisation I was hoping to coach for: tell me about your purpose as an organisation. Tell me what's really important for you as an organisation. How well, I'd be really interested to know if you could do a culture audit, I'd be really interested to know what your results of your employee engagement is, what your well-being processes are. What's your strategy as a business? What are you trying to achieve? And how can that be incorporated in the coaching that I deliver on a one-to-one basis? So this is an ecosystem perhaps that we can start to use. And at 3 o'clock this morning, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone that was on this programme, it came to me. The culture web that I haven't visited for some time. Yes, the culture web is actually where my thinking was coming from on the inside out. How do we tell our story as coaches and coaching providers? And I just thank my subconscious, yet again, that subconscious servant of mine and all of ours, for coming up with that solution last minute. So the final discussion, and we've got probably, I'll give you about 7, maybe 8 minutes on this last one, is to try and come up with some of this. There's a lot in here, I appreciate it. I don't think you're going to actually cover any of it by all means, but maybe moving on from why the myths and realities exist, which I think is a really helpful thing. We covered that already. What's the worst that can happen for stakeholders, coaches and coaches if we continue to operate the system as it is? What's the worst that can happen? And then conversely, what would define good coaching governance beyond what we already have? And I think we've talked about the code of conduct and the competencies, and we've talked about Michelle's comments around supervision, about CPD. But what else defines good coaching governance? And so I'm going to give you now till, what should we say? Would it be okay sort of to do 7 minutes and then back in the room to wrap this together? Thanks so much. I'm mindful, everybody, that we've only got a minute of this session before we go into networking. And just like to say that I'd be really interested to get more feedback from that last breakout session. Just get your sense of what feel like myths, what don't, and also the other questions that I'd asked. So if you can hang around, it would be great. I'm just going to sort of wrap this session up. If there's any comments you've got, maybe a 1 word or a few words in the chat would be really helpful and a good use of time to think about that second breakout room and what were the key points that came through from it. How do you combine the outside-in framework with the inside-out? Is that Esther, is that a question or a rhetorical question? How do you actually go about doing that?
Short answer is yes. The other one is it's a tension between the two, and you have to be in both frameworks. And I don't know how to do it, and I don't know if it's possible and to what degree they're exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And one of the things I was going to say in closing, before, if people have to leave, that I just get the sense this is an important conversation. Maybe it's just my interest in governance and my love of coaching that make it interesting for me. But I would love it if any of you, or however many people feel they want to, please connect with me. I do want to carry this conversation on. I would love your deeper thinking around it, either on a one-to-one or as part of a group, if you'd be interested in continuing to develop this. And thank you, Nicola, for setting some of the slides too as well. Anything particularly before we close down this session that really is important that's shared with the whole group before we go into networking session? Any really great moments of insight?
Karen, I think that one of the things that we realize is that until companies, as somebody said, makes this something that's measurable,
yes,
then it's always going to be a perk. And as a perk, it's not ever going to fall under governance or standardization.
Lovely. Yeah, Yossi, thank you. And I agree, because obviously it's not a legal framework and it's not a regulatory framework. It's more a code of governance, a code of conduct. But it's more than behavioural, and it's not only about the coach, I think is the point that we're making here, which is that shared ownership between the coach, the organisation, and what work we can do together to get the best results. Thanks for that lovely point. Esther, your point about, how do you connect the inside and the out? I haven't got the answer to that yet, but I think there lies the nub, the missing link that I mentioned on the final slide of the breakout. That's the bit where the research is needing to be done and some guidance provided, perhaps. Tineke, before we move into the breakout room.
So very simple, a lovely something that came from our group, and that it's EMCC is there and ICF is there, and the providers, whether they're internal coaching or external, they need to be EMCC accredited, because that's what EMCC is for. It makes your life so much easier if you know that everyone is aware of the code of conduct. That's our contribution from our group.
I think that's a wonderful point to end on. I have nothing further to say than that, Tineke. Thank you, and thank you to your group. There's some fantastic stuff. The word mess just comes into it, this conversation over and over again. Really get that. I just want to say thank you so much on behalf of Lawrence and myself for joining today. I found this so stimulating, and just wanted to pass over to you, Nicola, and hope to see some of you in the networking, if not as many as possible. Kevin.
Kevin's applauding. And I take that applause and add to it as well with a massive thank you to Karen and Lawrence on behalf of the EMCC Global as well. I mean, the discussion continues, which is fantastic. I mean, you opened it up in November. We've progressed it a little bit here today, but I love messiness. Messiness is great. Messiness means that we've got lots of things to unpick and to bring in new perspectives and new ideas. So I look forward to this conversation continuing, and thank you so much for pushing us in a good direction today.
Thanks, Nicola. Kevin, I love the photos. I just can't see what they are.
Oh, I want to see them too. I wonder if we can.
I'm up in the Highlands of Scotland. I've climbed all the Munros. There are 282 of them. And
oh my God.
These are summit shots of most of them.
Wonderful. I can see them now. Thank you so much. Lovely to connect with you.
That is wonderful.